Okay, thank you very much. Let's end this day on a thank you cheerful note, dying and dissaving. Okay, so let me mention this is still work in progress. So I'm happy for any comments on how to move forward. That's very good. Okay. So in economics in general and in household finance in particular, we think about behaviors over the life cycle. So naturally, we also need to consider the end of life. So we assume that individuals should smooth consumption over their expected lifetime. So then the question is, what happens if individuals suddenly face new information on their expected lifetime? Do they readjust and smooth consumption accordingly? So a key component of this kind of life cycle model is the probability of surviving from one period to the next. And that's then the question that I'm asking. So does survival probability have a causal effect on individuals' consumption savings decision? The reason why survival probability matters that together with the discount rate, it determines how much weight we should put on utility from each time period during life. So what happens when survival probability falls is essentially that the discount rate is higher. So we become more impatient. So we'd rather consume today than wait with and save and consume tomorrow. It's also interesting because we know that there is a strong correlation between health and economic outcomes, and survival probability is one part of health. But it's typically hard to pin down the causal relationship here. Is it the lack of wealth, for example, that causes bad health? Or is it bad health that limits wealth accumulation during life, or some unobservable factors such as preferences and patience that determines behavior that affects both of these factors negatively? Now, so to study this question, there are two key empirical challenges. So first is data requirements. So we need to be able to measure individual survival probability and changes in that precisely. And then we want to be able to match that to active savings decisions of the individual. And given the literature on life cycle savings, we also need to be able to take into account bequest motives, so family connections. And we also know that the marginal utility of consumption may be affected by health status. So we also need to be able to match that in some way. And then the second challenge is identification. So whose survival probabilities should we compare to identify a causal effect here? So in this paper, I address these two challenges using Swedish administrative data. So it's population-wide data. And I study how year-on-year changes in survival probability affect savings. And given the high level of detail on diagnosis and timing of diagnosis in the data, I can define a precise measure of survival probability at an individual level. And what's also nice with the asset holding data that I have access to is that I observe individual assets. So when I look at wealth change between 2 years, I can disentangle what is due to price effects, so a passive change in wealth, and what's due to the active decision of the individual. Also, I would say that the Swedish institutional setting is an advantage here to study the effect of mortality risk. So given the comprehensive social insurance system, there is a limited motive of saving for medical expenditures. So there is a cap on medical out-of-pocket expenses at around $300 per year an individual. So this is typically something that otherwise will make things complicated when you look at health shocks and savings motives. So given the setting, I can abstract from medical expenses. I identify causality using the randomness in the exact timing of a health shock. So I compare individuals that have the same health shock a few years apart. And the idea is that we want to compare individuals that have the same propensity for a given disease. So for example, for lifestyle reasons or for genetic reasons. And just to mention the findings briefly, I find that annual savings actually increases in response to lower survival probability. So that would be in contrast what we would expect from a very simple life cycle model. But there is heterogeneity here, especially across financial resources of the individual, but also bequest motives. I will get back to this. Yes?
Is it possible for people to look for private healthcare here in Sweden?
So I would say it's a limited possibility. I don't think there is a large market, and it's definitely access to very expensive treatments would be very limited. So what is tricky is to see, okay, the very rich individuals might go to Switzerland for some, and of course I won't observe that, but from what I've heard just anecdotally, that it's still very uncommon that this will happen, and especially it won't drive these kind of results that I will show you.
So if you're not feeling very well, maybe you don't want to spend a lot of money?
Yes, exactly. So that's definitely one point. I will get back to that in a minute. Yeah. Okay, so to think about this question, I have a simple 2-period consumption savings model with uncertain survival. And the results I will show you will focus on the first item here. So what we would expect is that when there's a negative shock to survival probability, savings should fall. So as I mentioned, we become more impatient, and there is so the expected value of those savings will be lower. But if we have bequest motives, then there will be a trade-off depending on the strength of the bequest motive. So would we rather dissave and consume today, or increase savings for bequests? But also financial resources matter. So if you have a very limited financial wealth and you're limited in how much you can borrow to consume, then how much you can respond to lower survival probability is bounded, essentially. The effect is bounded compared to someone with large resources. But then, of course, a health shock could also affect your ability to earn income, in particular if you're working age. But also, we know there's a literature on the marginal utility of consumption depending on your health status, and specifically on your non-medical consumption. So, for example, if you're not feeling well, or if you're physically limited in how much you can consume, you will not enjoy it as much. But then the effect will also depend on timing. So if it's a temporary health shock, then marginal utility might be lower today, but it might go back to normal tomorrow. That's what you would expect. Then you might prefer to save for tomorrow when marginal utility is high and consume then. But the effect isn't clear cut because we still have the effect of lower survival probability, so the value of those savings will be lower. So there's a trade-off. However, if it's we only expect future marginal utility to go down, so I might feel well today, but I expect that tomorrow I will not feel as well because I know sort of the progress of the disease, then I'd rather consume today when marginal utility is high. So I'll focus the results on the first part here, but then I do in the paper some tests to also control for these other factors. Okay, so I use individual level annual data on detailed asset holdings. So to measure savings, I look at the active change in different asset classes at individual level. So it's risky assets, housing, capital insurance, bank accounts, private pension contributions is what I observe, and then I look at the measure net of any change in debt. So it's an annual net savings measure. And I match this to medical data, where I observe all diagnoses recorded in a hospital. So to define this measure of survival probability, we can think of it as an development of a life table. So in a life table, we can see the survival rates of individuals of a given age and gender, and this will then vary. But what I do is that I also take into account the individual health. So to define this measure, I make an assumption, and that's that individuals of the same age, gender, and diagnosis category have the same survival prospects. So that's the idea. So in year T, I group individuals by age, gender, and diagnosis, and then I look at the share of individuals that are alive in year T plus 1. And that I assign as the survival probability in year T. And just to give you a view of what this measure looks like, so here I have the 18 different diagnosis categories that I'm using. Out of one then is healthy or less severe diagnosis across life and genders. And what I want you to take away from these colorful figures is the fact that it's a large variation depending on who you are. So for example, let's see, 70-year-old male who is healthy has a survival probability of about 0.98. If he has a chronic lower respiratory disease, it's 0.95, and if he has a bad cancer diagnosis, it's 0.87. So there's a large variation here that I'm using. Okay, so something about the empirical strategy. I use a difference in differences approach, and the key assumption is that the timing of the diagnosis is as good as random, at least within a given window. Yes? Yes?
It seems to me that male at the age of 80 are more likely to survive if they have diabetes or arthritis, these being lines, than if they're healthy. I'm just wondering to what extent this is a result of a small sample.
Probably, so I would say that when you see that there is sort of above the healthy survival, I would interpret this that if this is the most severe diagnosis that you have, then you're a quite healthy person. So this is having this kind of diagnosis is actually good news, if you like.
But there is explicitly a healthy line.
Yes, exactly, which is great.
But I be undiagnosed.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Do you have information on depression as another diagnosis?
Okay, so this is also a good point, because this could also affect your willingness to consume if this shock is just bad news and you become depressed. So what I can do is that I have medical drugs that I will look into. I haven't done that yet, at least to be able to control for that if you get some antidepressant medication, and if that is...
I was also thinking that it may be an interesting exercise to check what happens there in terms of saving behavior, in the sense that I'm guessing that maybe depression doesn't necessarily lead to a significant change in the probability of survival, but it may affect whether you feel like spending or not.
Yes.
And you could sort of try to understand what exactly is the mechanism that is driving one possible.
Yes, I think it's a very good point, because that is sort of in the direction where I'm going. So thinking about how different diagnoses affect, say, survival and marginal utility of consumption differently. So some will affect only survival, some will affect only marginal utility, some will affect both severely, and to sort of tease out that variation. Yes.
And maybe the other distinction that would be interesting would be to look at a type of diagnosis that are making someone immobile. I would think that a big part of the consumption spending here is on holidays. If it's not medical expenses with you, it's not in this context. Significant changes can be, big chunk. If you cancel holidays for a year, you're going to end up saving something, and it will be, a significant amount on increasing.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the measures that I use to look at that is to measure marginal utility is is days in hospital. So if you have a severe diagnosis, you spend a lot of time in hospital, then you're limited in how much you can travel and etc. Yeah. So, but it's,
I also wanted to ask about the randomness of the diagnosis, right? Because it depends on when you go to the doctor, right? So, and there may be certain characteristics that predict whether or not you go to the doctor early versus late.
yes. So I think, I mean, this is a very good point, and that's the key to have this identification. So what I can do, which I haven't done yet, is sort of try to predict whether you end up in the treated or control group with all the observable characteristics that I have. So say education, all these things that you can imagine will affect your propensity to go to a doctor. Just to see that I cannot predict whether you're the sort of the one going to the doctor early rather than later. But it's a good point, yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So that's, yeah, I have that information whether it's a planned or emergency visit. So that's another dimension that I can look into. Definitely. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, exactly. So the treated individuals are then those who will have a diagnosis in year tau, and the control group are those who will be diagnosed in year tau plus 3 in this case. So it's a window of 3 years. Also, I use continuous treatment variable. So it's a change in survival probability in the year tau. So when the first group have their the first severe diagnosis. So the idea is that then the treatment variable will be large or small depending on the diagnosis. But for the control group, it's going to be a marginal change. Also, to deal with large outliers in my savings measure and still include non-positive values, I use inverse hyperbolic sign transformation of savings, which is essentially the same as the log transformation for positive values and the negative of log for negative values. Which means that I can also interpret the coefficient beta as if it had been a log linear specification. And then I control for some demographics, and I also include individual fixed effects, so to control for unobserved time invariant heterogeneity. So the control group are individuals who will have the same diagnosis just 3 years later. Yes, so the idea is that the exact timing of the diagnosis will be as good as random. What I will do is also play around with this window to ensure that it's not driven by them being, say, 3 years later. So you can think of 3 years as a long window to have a 1 year window instead of 2 years, etc. So that's one way of dealing with that, and also ensuring that they are not different. Okay. Okay, so now I'll show you 2 figures that will summarize the results that I find. And if you recall, the key prediction is that as survival probability falls, we expect individuals to save less. And this would then be a positive coefficient. But what we see here is this blue dot here, which is the average, and it's negative. So as individuals' survival probability falls, savings actually increase. So these different dots then show different specifications. So one, as I mentioned, there is heterogeneity here. So for example, if we look at whether you have children or not, we expect individuals who have children to have a bequest motive, and that they would dissave less, if you like, in response to lower survival probability, or at least that there is a trade-off. And that's what we see here. So we see that this pink specification is a stronger increase in savings in response to lower survival probability compared to individuals without children. However, if we look at the dimension on whether you have a spouse or not, I don't find any motive for bequest motives between spouses, so, or at least less than what we would expect. So here we actually see that this dark green here are singles. They are increasing savings by more than those who are in a couple. So here we would expect perhaps couples to increase savings by more in terms of leaving a bequest. However, there are different explanations for this. So one could be if this is driven by the health shock having also implications for income. The two-person household could act as an insurance mechanism. So if I worry that my future income will go down and I'm single, then I might increase my savings. The need for that will not be as large for individuals who are in a household, in a two-person household. I haven't looked into that, but it's a very good point, and also look at sort of their respective income before, if it's the main income in the household. So it's individual savings. So the data is at individual level. So you have assets at recorded in the tax authority at individual level. So we have an individual tax system. So that's why all data is at individual level. And then what I will do is to sort of look at the household level too, to have that I mentioned. But the first point is to look at the individual. A different explanation would be that consuming together with someone is much more fun. So go traveling or go to a restaurant might be more enjoyable if you have a partner. So then the surviving partner might actually prefer to consume while the sick partner is alive rather than wait for this as a bequest. Let me go to the second set of results, and here I look at the effect across financial capacity. So again, the average effect is the blue dot here, and if you have a small financial wealth and limited borrowing capacity, you're bound in how much you can react, whereas richer individuals are not bounded in the same way. So here I define small financial wealth if they have less than 2 years worth of consumption to sustain consumption for 2 years, essentially. I define debt capacity if they have real net wealth worth 2 years worth of consumption, so that they can put this as collateral and borrow against to finance consumption. So what we see here is that this red dot here are individuals who have a small financial wealth and a low debt capacity. And we see that they are increasing savings the most. Whereas individuals who are richer here and have large financial wealth and high debt capacity are actually dissaving. So here we observe some dissaving behavior in response to lower survival probability. I want to ensure that these results are not driven by the poor household having a different household composition or worse income shocks related to the health shock. So I limit to a type of model agent who is single with no children and above 65, so income shouldn't matter. And I find the same pattern. And I also want to rule out it's not driven by the poor having worse diseases than the rich. So I limited the analysis to a specific diagnosis, so only looking at cancer or heart attack, for example, and the pattern is still there. So to conclude, are individuals dying and dissaving? Well, yes, but only if they have the financial resources to do so. And that's true no matter the health state, defined as these broad diagnosis categories. I find support for bequest motives among parents, but not between spouses, which is potentially due to this company state dependent utility. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I wonder what the punchline is. So, I mean, it's interesting, right? But are the policy implications that we should be thinking about, or? Like
No. So I mean, it's a good point. So one one approach to think about this is sort of how are individuals affected by health shocks. So we know pretty well what happens to their income, but then this is sort of another dimension, what happens to their savings and etc. A different way to look at it is sort of, do we find evidence of consumption smoothing in this kind of setting? So this is a situation that will occur. So many individuals with at some point in life face this new information on survival probability, and then do we find evidence of consumption smoothing or not? And so the short answer is that of course it depends on whether you who you are and your resources essentially.
Thank you.
Just one quick comment, but I cannot remember the author. There was a job market candidate a couple of years ago, working maybe with Norwegian data. Definitely was a Scandinavian country. That was looking at patients diagnosed with cancer following a similar identification strategy and then their bequest motives. So given you also focus on bequest motives, maybe you want to search for that paper.
Yeah.
I think he found a job somewhere. ITAM is the university in Mexico. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, I'm aware of the paper, and I mean, it's a similar setup. Yeah. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, due to the time constraint, let me conclude with the session. Thank you very much. Thank you, Clara, for the presentation, and thank you all for the comments and the questions.
Okay, so this is the end of the conference. Thanks so much, everybody. So the next conference is in Miami, is that true? Yeah, so we should look out for the call for papers. That's the takeaway. So we try to make this an annual thing, so we will organize the EU version at least next year. Okay, thanks so much.